Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Archives. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax and slowly fall asleep. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. If you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. This happened a long time ago, probably around 30 years now, but the way it affected my family never really faded. Even though I was very young at the time, the emotional weight of it settled into our household and stayed there. Some events don't need you to fully understand them in the moment to leave a permanent mark. This was one of those. My mother was an elementary school teacher in a small town in Louisiana. I don't remember the exact grade she taught back then, but I believe it was either first or second grade. She loved teaching. It wasn't just a job to her. She cared deeply about her students, worried about them, celebrated their progress, and took their struggles personally. To her, they weren't just names on a roll sheet. They were children she spent most of her days with. Children she felt responsible for in a way that went beyond the classroom. Small-town schools have a different feeling to them. Teachers often know the families. They see parents at the grocery store. They run into students at church, at community events, at the gas station. There's a sense that everyone is connected somehow. That closeness can be comforting, but when something goes wrong, it also means the pain spreads faster and deeper. One of my mother's students was a young boy. I don't remember his name now, and even if I did, it wouldn't feel right to repeat it. What matters is that he was just a child, around the same age as the kids in my house. He went to school every day. He had a desk, a backpack, homework, and a teacher who cared about him. He was part of a routine that made the world feel safe and predictable. Then one day, he didn't come home. I don't remember how the news first broke, but I remember the shift in atmosphere. Adults whispering, phones ringing more often than usual, a tension in the air that even a 4-year-old could sense without understanding why. Something was wrong in a way that felt bigger than scraped knees or bad grades. The boy was missing. In a small town, that kind of news spreads almost instantly. People start searching. Parents panic. Neighbors check yards, sheds, and empty houses. Teachers worry not just as professionals, but as people who have spent hours every day with the child who is suddenly gone. My mother was terrified. She tried to stay calm for her students, but at home it was different. I remember her face looking tight and tired. I remember her voice sounding strained when she talked to my father. She kept saying how young he was, how close his house was, how this wasn't supposed to happen there. Then they found him. He was dead. The boy had been strangled. His body was found in a house just a few doors down from his own home. That detail alone is horrifying, not miles away, not somewhere distant or unfamiliar, just a short walk from where he lived. Close enough that safety should have existed, close enough that it shattered any illusion that danger only comes from far away. The reality of it hit my mother like a physical blow. This wasn't an abstract tragedy she heard about on the news. This was one of her students, a child she had taught, a child she had spoken to, corrected, encouraged, and smiled at, a child she had last seen alive in her classroom. I was probably around 4 years old at the time. My older brother was close in age to the boy who was killed. That fact alone made everything feel more real, more terrifying, more personal. My mother couldn't look at my brother without seeing that student's face in her mind. Couldn't imagine his routine without thinking about how easily it could have been disrupted. The idea that a child could be taken and killed so close to home broke something inside her. She questioned everything afterward. The safety of the neighborhood, the assumptions people make about familiarity, the trust parents place in their surroundings, the idea that children are safe simply because they are nearby. For a long time after that, our house felt different. My mother became more protective, more alert, more cautious in ways that weren't obvious to us as kids, but were very real. She watched more closely. She worried more. She asked more questions about where we were going and who we were with, not because she wanted to control us, but because she had seen firsthand how fragile safety could be. I didn't fully understand what had happened back then. At 4 years old, death is a vague concept. You know it's bad. You know it makes adults cry. But you don't grasp the permanence or the cruelty of it. What I understood was my mother's reaction, her fear, her grief, the way it shook her sense of the world. As I grew older, the story came back into focus. I learned more details slowly over the years, the way adults do when they revisit something painful, never all at once. I learned that the boy had been strangled. I learned how close the house was to his own. I learned how deeply it affected the school. How the teachers struggled to explain absence to a classroom full of children who didn't yet have the language for loss. I learned how it changed my mother as a teacher. She never stopped caring deeply about her students. But there was always an undercurrent of worry after that. She paid attention to things she might not have before. Mood changes, behavior shifts, kids who seemed withdrawn or frightened. She became more sensitive to the possibility that something might be wrong at home or in a child's life. That kind of awareness doesn't come from training alone, it comes from trauma. Even now, decades later, when she talks about that student, her voice changes. It softens, but there's also tension there, a quiet sadness that never fully resolved. Teachers are taught to maintain professional distance, but events like that collapse those boundaries entirely. When a child in your care is taken and killed, it doesn't matter how many years pass, you carry that with you. What stays with me the most is how close everything was. The boy didn't disappear into the unknown. He was taken to a house a few doors down. That fact alone rewires how you think about danger. It isn't always some stranger from far away. It isn't always someone who comes from outside the community. Sometimes it's something that exists within the same streets, the same routines, the same sense of normalcy. That idea frightened my mother deeply. It made her realize that no amount of familiarity guarantees safety, that knowing your neighbors doesn't mean knowing what they're capable of, that bad things don't announce themselves ahead of time. For her, this wasn't just about one child. It was about all children, about the vulnerability of kids who trust adults by default, about the responsibility teachers and parents feel to protect them, even when protection isn't always possible. For me, growing up with that story in the background shaped how I see the world. Even though I didn't experience the event directly, I absorbed its impact. I learned early that tragedy doesn't need a dramatic buildup. It can arrive quietly in a place that feels safe and leave devastation behind. I learned that adults don't always have answers, that sometimes all they have is fear and grief. I also learned how deeply events like this affect the people who are left behind. The child's family, obviously, suffered in ways that can't be described, but the ripple effect reached much farther. Teachers, classmates, neighbors, parents who suddenly looked at their own children differently, an entire community that had to come to terms with the fact that something unthinkable had happened among them. My mother never forgot him. I don't think teachers ever truly forget the students they lose, especially in circumstances like that. There's no closure that makes sense, no explanation that brings comfort, just a sense that the world failed someone who didn't deserve it. Looking back now as an adult, I understand why this shook her to her core. She was responsible for teaching children how to read, how to write, how to count, how to navigate the world. But nothing prepares you for the realization that one of them will never grow up, that their life ended violently and senselessly while they were still learning the basics of existence. I think about how close my brother was in age to that boy, and how easily my mother could see the two of them as interchangeable in her fear, how that must have haunted her, how it likely kept her awake at night, replaying every possible scenario, every what if. What if someone had noticed something sooner? What if he had taken a different path home? What if an adult had been there? Those questions don't lead anywhere helpful, but they're almost impossible to stop once they start. This story isn't famous. It didn't become a national headline that people remember decades later. It's a quiet tragedy, the kind that happens in small towns and leaves scars that never make it into history books. But for the people who lived it, it's just as real and just as devastating. It's also a reminder of how violence against children affects far more than the immediate victim. It changes how parents parent, how teachers teach, how communities trust, how people perceive safety. The damage spreads outward, invisible but persistent. Even now, when I think about it, I feel that same unease. Not panic, but a deep, sad awareness of how fragile childhood is, how much we rely on assumptions of safety, how easily those assumptions can be shattered. My mother went on teaching. She continued to care for generation after generation of students. She smiled, encouraged, disciplined, and nurtured them the way good teachers do. But that loss stayed with her, woven into her understanding of the world. And it stayed with us too. Some events don't need to be experienced directly to shape you. Sometimes all it takes is seeing how deeply something breaks someone you love. Watching the person who always seems strong and capable suddenly confront a reality they can't fix. That was one of those moments. It happened 30 years ago, but it still matters. It still echoes. And it still reminds me that behind every story like this is a child who should have had a future and an adult who will never stop carrying the weight of their loss. This happened in Daly City, just outside of San Francisco, in 1975. At the time, it was a quiet suburban area, the kind of place where families lived close together. Kids walked to school and neighbors recognized one another. Nothing about the street suggested it would become the setting for something so brutal and strange. The couple at the center of it were Phil Beatles and Cheryl Beatles. From what later came out, they were swingers and belonged to a sex club. That alone wouldn't have been public knowledge, if not for what followed. But the investigation revealed something far worse. It was alleged that they included their young children in their sexual activities. That detail alone makes the entire case difficult to think about, and even harder to talk about without feeling sick. The murders took place in the middle of the night. Phil and Cheryl were found brutally killed in the family room of their home. They had been sleeping nude on a mattress on the floor. From the layout and the condition of the room, investigators believed there may have been a party the night before. The mattress on the floor suggested it wasn't just used for sleeping, but possibly left there deliberately. Whether that was for convenience or for something darker is something no one can say for certain. They were murdered with extreme violence using both an axe and a gun. While this was happening, their 4 children were upstairs, asleep. At around 4:30 in the morning, the oldest child, a 14-year-old boy, woke up early for his paper route. He went downstairs and discovered the bodies of his parents. That image alone is almost impossible to comprehend. A child starting an ordinary morning routine and instead finding something that would permanently scar him. Police arrived and launched an extensive investigation. The crime scene was chaotic, but there was no clear suspect, no obvious signs of forced entry, no witnesses who saw anyone come or go during the night. During the investigation, an address book was found in the house. It contained somewhere between 80 and 100 names. Every single person listed was questioned. They were friends, acquaintances, people connected through the sex club, and others from their social circle. All of them were eventually excluded as suspects. No arrests were made. The case went cold. What made this especially unsettling was the nature of what investigators believed had been going on in that house. If the Beatles were involving their own children in sexual activities, it raises horrifying questions about who else might have been involved, who might have known, and who might have been affected. It isn't a stretch to wonder whether other children from families connected to that circle may also have been abused. That kind of environment doesn't usually exist in isolation, and then a few years later, something else happened. Another violent death occurred in Daly City. A divorced woman living with her children was beaten to death by her teenage son. The only detail I ever knew for certain was the last name, Langlois. It was shocking on its own, but what made it stand out was the proximity. Same city, same general area, and a teenager capable of extreme violence. That's where speculation starts to creep in. I've often wondered whether there could have been a connection between these two cases, if the Beatles' address book had contained her name, or if the families had crossed paths through the same social circles, if that teenager had been exposed to things no child should ever see, if shame, trauma, or rage had built up until it exploded. I want to be clear here. This is not an accusation supported by evidence. It's a theory that has lingered in my mind because of how little else makes sense. Officially, the Beatles' murders remain unsolved. No one has been charged. No definitive suspect has ever been named. But what makes this harder to ignore is a moment that happened later. Our street was only about 2 blocks up from Westlake Shopping Center. One day, my mom and my sister were about to go shopping at the grocery store there. Before they even made it inside, a teenage boy ran up to them. He was covered in blood. My sister recognized him. He had a crush on her. He was a student at Westmore High School, and he had been in her typing class. He walked right up to them, calm enough to be unsettling, and he petted my sister's hair. Neither my mom nor my sister knew what to think. They were shocked, confused, and disturbed, but at the time, they didn't know what had happened. 2 days later, they found out the truth. That teenager had just killed his mother. Realizing that they had been face to face with someone moments after he committed murder was horrifying on its own. Knowing that he was capable of that level of violence made everything else feel different in hindsight. When you put all of this together, it becomes hard not to wonder. A couple involved in extreme sexual behavior, possibly abusing their children, murdered in their own home. A violent teenage killer in the same city a few years later. A young person who may have been exposed to something deeply damaging. Shame, anger, and trauma that had nowhere to go. It isn't hard to imagine a scenario where someone who had been abused might seek revenge, or where years of suppressed trauma could surface in explosive, violent ways. That doesn't excuse anything, but it does raise uncomfortable questions about cause and effect. What haunts me most is that the Beatles' murders were never solved. Someone murdered 2 people with an axe and a gun, while 4 children slept upstairs, and they were never identified. No arrest, no trial, no closure. That kind of violence doesn't usually come from nowhere, and it doesn't usually disappear without a trace. Daly City moved on, at least on the surface. Life continued, kids went to school, people shopped at Westlake. But under that normalcy, there was always a sense that something had gone terribly wrong and never been made right. Cases like this leave scars on communities, even if people don't talk about them openly. They change how safe a place feels. They make you look at neighbors differently. They make you realize how much can be hidden behind closed doors. I don't claim to know the truth. What I know is that there are very few people capable of committing that level of violence, even fewer who might have a reason rooted in something as powerful and destructive as shame, trauma, and abuse. When crimes like these remain unsolved, they invite speculation not because people want drama, but because the human mind struggles to accept that something so horrific can simply have no answer. The Beatles case remains a dark stain on Daly City's history. 2 parents murdered, 4 children left without answers, a community left wondering who did it and why. And years later, another act of extreme violence that only deepened the unease. Some stories don't end cleanly. They linger, half-formed, uncomfortable, and unresolved. This is one of those stories. It was one of those winters that people in Florida still talk about years later because it didn't feel like Florida at all. The air was dry in a way that made your skin crack. Nights were colder than usual, cold enough to threaten crops that normally never had to worry about frost. For farmers, that kind of weather meant panic, and panic often leads to decisions that fix one problem while quietly creating another. Nearby farms began pumping enormous amounts of groundwater out of the earth to protect their crops. The method was simple but aggressive. Flood the fields with water so that when temperatures dropped, a layer of ice would form over the plants and shield them from frost damage. It worked, at least in the short term. The crops survived, but the land beneath them did not. Florida sits on limestone, porous and fragile, carved out over thousands of years by moving water. When you remove too much water too quickly, the ground can no longer support itself. Cavities collapse, the surface gives way. Sinkholes open without warning, swallowing whatever happens to be above them. That winter, dozens of sinkholes appeared across the area. Roads buckled and split open, buildings cracked or shifted. Yards suddenly had gaping holes where solid ground had been the day before. It felt like the earth itself was unstable, like something fundamental had gone wrong beneath everyone's feet. One of those sinkholes appeared in my brother's backyard. Compared to what we were seeing on the news, it seemed small, about 3 feet wide and 4 feet deep. Not something you'd imagine swallowing a house or a person whole. It opened up quietly, without drama, just a dark, raw wound in the ground. It was located near his pasture and blueberry field, about 20 feet from the outside wall of his bedroom. When we first saw it, relief was the dominant emotion. It hadn't damaged the house, it hadn't undermined the foundation. It wasn't directly under a structure or near a road. It was just there, ugly and unsettling but manageable. You could walk around it, fence it off, fill it in eventually. At the time, it felt like a close call that had already passed. I remember thinking how lucky he was. Lucky that it hadn't opened under the house. Lucky that it hadn't been bigger. Lucky that no one had been hurt. We talked about it casually, almost dismissively, the way people do when danger shows itself, but doesn't fully commit. None of us really understood what a sinkhole could do. That changed the day I woke up and turned on the news. There was a story about a man in Florida who had been swallowed alive by a sinkhole when his bedroom collapsed into the ground beneath him. The report was quiet, almost restrained, but the details were horrifying. The man was Jeff Bush. He had been asleep in his bed when the ground beneath his home gave way. The sinkhole opened directly under his bedroom, pulling the floor, the bed, and his body down into the darkness. His brother was in the house at the time. He heard the crash. He heard the screams. He tried to reach him. He ran into the room, but the floor was gone. There was nothing solid left to stand on, nothing to grab. The hole was deep, unstable, and still collapsing. Every attempt to get closer risked pulling him in too. He stood there, helpless, listening to his brother scream from somewhere below, buried under debris and earth. Emergency crews arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. The sinkhole was too deep. The edges were unstable. The ground kept shifting, threatening to swallow anyone who got close. They lowered equipment. They used cameras. They tried to detect movement or sound, but they couldn't safely enter the hole. The news reported that Jeff's screams could be heard for a time. That detail is the one that stays with me the most. He didn't die instantly. He was trapped, alive, buried beneath his own home. His brother and rescue workers listened, unable to reach him. Over time, the screams grew weaker. Eventually, they stopped altogether. No signs of life were found. They never recovered his body. The house was eventually demolished. The land deemed too unstable to ever build on again. His death became one of the most extreme examples of how dangerous sinkholes can be. But for the people who lived near where it happened, it was more than a headline. It was a warning. What made it even harder to process was how close it was. This didn't happen in some distant part of the state. It happened only a couple of miles from my childhood home. Close enough that the roads looked familiar. Close enough that the landscape felt the same. Close enough that it could have been anyone, including my brother. As I watched the coverage, my mind kept going back to that small sinkhole in his backyard, 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep. Harmless, we'd thought. I pictured its location again, measured the distance in my head, 20 feet from his bedroom wall. Close enough that it suddenly didn't feel far at all. I realized how wrong my sense of safety had been. Sinkholes don't come with guarantees. A small one doesn't mean there won't be a larger one tomorrow. A shallow collapse doesn't mean there isn't a massive void beneath it, waiting to give way. The ground doesn't warn you before it fails. It doesn't crack slowly like ice on a lake. It just disappears. The idea that someone could be asleep in their bed, doing nothing wrong, and suddenly be pulled into the earth is deeply unsettling in a way that sticks with you. It strips away the illusion that home is the safest place to be. It turns sleep, one of the most vulnerable states a person can be in, into something dangerous. I couldn't stop thinking about Jeff's brother, standing there listening to screams he couldn't stop. Knowing exactly where his brother was but being physically unable to reach him, that kind of helplessness is almost impossible to imagine. It's the sort of trauma that doesn't fade with time. It rewires you. Every time I think about sinkholes now, I don't picture holes in the ground. I picture a bedroom collapsing in the dark. I picture a man waking up just long enough to realize something is terribly wrong. I picture the sound of wood breaking, earth rushing in, and then being buried alive. I picture screams echoing up through the rubble, unanswered. That fear never really left me. My family still lives in the area. They still walk on that land. They still sleep in houses built on the same limestone foundation, in a region where groundwater can be drained too quickly and the earth can suddenly give way. Every time there's a drought, every time farmers pump extra water, every time there's a cold snap that pushes people to protect crops at any cost, I feel that familiar tightness in my chest. It's not a fear you can do much about. You can't see sinkholes forming beneath you. You can't hear them coming. You can't predict exactly where or when they'll open. You can do soil testing. You can monitor groundwater levels. You can fill visible holes. But none of that guarantees safety. That's what makes this kind of death so terrifying. There's no villain, no warning sign you can easily respond to, no decision you can point to and say, that's where it went wrong. Jeff Bush didn't take a risk. He didn't ignore a hazard. He went to sleep in his own bed, and that was enough. After hearing about his death, the small sinkhole in my brother's yard stopped looking small. It stopped feeling contained. It became a symbol of something much larger and more unpredictable. Every crack in the ground suddenly mattered. Every uneven patch of soil raised questions. I started imagining worst-case scenarios without meaning to. What if it had opened at night instead of during the day? What if it had spread beneath the house? What if my brother had been asleep when it collapsed? What if someone had tried to investigate it and fallen in? Those thoughts aren't productive, but they're hard to stop once they take hold. Even now, years later, sinkholes still scare me more than most natural disasters. Hurricanes give warnings, fires spread visibly, floods rise over time. Earthquakes shake the ground, but you at least feel them happening. Sinkholes don't announce themselves. They wait quietly beneath you, shaped by forces you can't see, and then they open without asking permission. The ground you trusted simply isn't there anymore. Whenever I hear about sinkholes now, my mind goes straight back to that winter, to the dry air, the cold nights, the desperate measures taken to save crops, the dozens of holes opening across the land, and the one that took a man's life while he slept. It also changed how I think about responsibility. On the surface, no one directly killed Jeff Bush, but the conditions that led to his death weren't entirely natural. They were influenced by human actions, over-pumping groundwater, ignoring the long-term consequences of short-term fixes, treating the land like an endless resource instead of a fragile system. That doesn't make the loss easier to process. If anything, it makes it more bitter. Someone died in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable, and there was no one to hold accountable in a clear, satisfying way. No trial, no sentence, just grief, shock, and a quiet warning that faded from the headlines over time. But for people who live there, it never really fades. Every creak in the house, every crack in the yard, every story about another sinkhole reopening or expanding brings it all back. It's a reminder that safety is sometimes an illusion built on things we don't fully understand. To this day, I still worry about my family. I worry about the land beneath their homes. I worry about cold winters and droughts. I worry about the kind of death that gives you no chance to fight back, no chance to run, no chance to say goodbye. And I worry about how easily it could happen again. Because once you understand how quickly the ground can disappear beneath you, it's hard to ever feel completely safe standing on it again. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. When I was still in school, and even now, more than a decade later, it's one of those memories that refuses to soften around the edges. Time didn't dull it. If anything, it sharpened certain details, especially the parts you wish your brain would let go of. Two guys from my hometown were really into cars. Not casually, either. They weren't just kids with loud exhausts showing off in parking lots. They were serious about it in the way teenagers can be when they find something that gives them identity and purpose. They worked on their cars constantly, poured money into modifications, tuned engines, swapped parts, talked specs like it was a second language. Everyone knew them as the car guys. They raced at the local track on open nights. That was the important part. They weren't just reckless for the sake of it. They went somewhere controlled, somewhere meant for speed. They wore helmets. There were rules. There were barriers and emergency crews. It wasn't completely safe, but it was structured. There were consequences for mistakes that didn't usually involve innocent people. Then the track shut down. I don't remember why exactly. Money issues, zoning, noise complaints, something like that. All I know is that when it closed, it left a vacuum. The racing didn't stop. It just lost its boundaries. They turned to street racing. At first, it was quiet, late at night, back roads, places people assumed were empty. But the thing about small towns is that nowhere is really empty. Roads still have houses, trees, mailboxes, driveways, curves you don't respect until it's too late. This happened near the end of the school year. They were both juniors. I was a freshman. That age difference mattered at the time. Juniors felt older, untouchable, like they existed on a different level. When something bad happened to people like that, it didn't feel real right away. They chose a road everyone knew was dangerous. A long, winding stretch with sharp curves and houses on both sides. Not a highway, not a straightaway. A road where you're supposed to slow down, not push 70 miles an hour. People had warned them about it before. Everyone knew that road had a reputation. That night, they lined up anyway, end to end. One car against the other. No safety gear, no barriers, no runoff, just asphalt, trees, and arrogance. They took off, engines screaming through the dark, pushing harder and harder as the road twisted beneath them. About a mile into the run, one of them tried to pass. No one will ever know for sure whether it was a mistake or a stupid gamble. Maybe he misjudged the distance. Maybe he thought he had more room. Maybe he didn't think at all. His front bumper tapped the rear of the other car. Not a big hit. Not something that would have mattered at low speed. At 70 miles per hour, it mattered. The tap forced the other car onto the shoulder. Gravel, uneven ground. The kind of surface that instantly destabilizes you when you're already going too fast. The driver panicked and overcorrected, trying to jerk the car back onto the road. That was it. The car lost control completely. It started flipping, end over end, sideways, violent and chaotic. Metal tearing, glass exploding. The sound must have been unreal, but no one described it in detail afterward. Sometimes people don't want to remember sounds like that. The car flipped several times before slamming into a large tree. The sudden stop was catastrophic. The driver wasn't wearing a seatbelt. When the car hit the tree, his body didn't stop with it. He was thrown through the windshield like he wasn't even part of the vehicle anymore. He slid along the pavement for roughly 30 feet before finally coming to rest. Alone, broken, and still alive, at least for a moment. The part that still makes my stomach turn is what happened next. The other driver, the one who tapped his bumper, didn't stop. He didn't pull over. He didn't run back. He didn't call for help from the scene. He just drove away into the night, leaving his friend crumpled on the road behind him. Whether it was fear, shock, or self-preservation doesn't really matter. The outcome is the same. He left him there. Eventually, someone called it in. Emergency responders arrived. Police blocked the road. EMTs rushed to the body lying on the pavement. This is the part I wish I'd never learned. The reports came out later. Small details that weren't meant for public consumption, but still made their way through the town like poison. When the EMT approached him and reached for his wrist to check for a pulse, they couldn't feel anything solid. Not because there was no pulse, because the bones in his arm had been pulverized. The report said his arm felt like jelly. No structure, no resistance, just crushed tissue where bone should have been. The same was true for most of the rest of his body. The violence of the crash had destroyed him internally, in a way that isn't visible from a distance, but unmistakable up close. I don't know how long he lived after that moment. I don't know if he was conscious. I don't know if he felt pain or confusion or fear. I don't know if he wondered where his friend was. Those questions are the kind your mind asks even when there are no answers, and they don't help. What I do know is that learning those details rewired something in me. I was young. I had never thought seriously about death before then, not in a visceral way. Not the kind of death that comes from choices, from speed, from seconds of bad judgment. This wasn't an illness or an accident you could chalk up to fate. This was preventable, layered with decisions that stacked up until there was no room left for correction. The town changed after that. People drove slower on that road for a while. Parents talked more openly about reckless driving. Teachers mentioned it carefully, like they didn't want to glorify it but felt obligated to warn us. The other driver faced consequences, but none of them felt proportional to the outcome. Nothing brings someone back. Nothing erases the image of a body broken beyond recognition. 12 years later, I still have nightmares. Not dramatic ones, not cinematic crashes. It's usually just fragments. A car flipping in darkness, a tree appearing too fast, a body sliding along pavement, or worse, the quiet detail of an EMT's hand closing around a wrist that shouldn't feel the way it does. What haunts me most isn't even the crash itself. It's the abandonment. The idea that in the most critical moment of someone's life, the person closest to them chose to leave. That fear or guilt or panic can override loyalty so completely that someone can disappear into the dark while another person lies dying behind them. It made me think differently about people, about how you never really know what someone will do when things go wrong, about how bravado and friendship and shared hobbies mean nothing when consequences arrive at full speed, about how fast fun turns into horror when physics finally asserts itself. I don't think about street racing the same way anymore. I don't romanticize it. I don't care how skilled someone thinks they are. Skill doesn't matter when you're racing on public roads. The margin for error is zero. The price for miscalculation is permanent. Every now and then, I still drive that road. I slow down without thinking about it. My foot eases off the gas automatically. The curve where it happened doesn't look special. There's no memorial, no sign, just trees, asphalt, and houses that have no idea what they witnessed. But I know, and that knowledge sits in the back of my mind every time someone talks about pushing limits, about being fearless, about how they know their car. All it takes is a tap, a shoulder, an overcorrection, 1 second, and then there's nothing left but reports, nightmares, and a memory that doesn't let go. This happened when I was about 20 years old, and even now, more than 20 years later, it hasn't faded the way most memories do. Some details blur with time, but others stay razor sharp, like your brain decided they were too important to ever let go. I was driving east on a divided road in northern Tucson. I can't say for certain which one it was anymore, maybe River, maybe Sunrise, but I remember the layout clearly enough. Multiple lanes, a center divider, the kind of road where traffic moves fast and you settle into that steady, almost automatic rhythm of driving. I was in the far left lane, just going along like any other day, not in a hurry, not distracted, just existing in that in-between state where your body drives and your mind drifts. Then something caught my eye. I glanced to my left, and for a split second my brain couldn't process what it was seeing. Another car went past me fast, close enough that I could clearly see it. The problem was that it wasn't in a lane. It was on the wrong side of the road. Not just drifting, not halfway over the line, fully on the wrong side, driving straight toward oncoming traffic. That moment snapped me fully awake. My heart jumped, and I remember this strange feeling of disbelief mixed with urgency. Your mind immediately starts scrambling for explanations. Maybe I misjudged it. Maybe there was construction. Maybe the divider ended and I didn't notice. But none of that made sense. This was clearly a divided road, and that car was heading directly into the path of cars coming the other way. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my phone and called the police. I remember trying to explain where I was, stumbling over landmarks and street names, because adrenaline makes it hard to sound coherent, even when you know what you're saying is important. I told them there was a car driving the wrong way, that it had just passed me, that it was heading toward oncoming traffic. I was talking fast, trying to be precise, knowing that seconds mattered. And then it happened. As I was still on the phone, still explaining, that car crested a blind rise in the road. There was no time for anyone to react, no swerving, no braking that could have made a difference. It hit another car head-on. The sound is what stayed with me the most. It wasn't like anything you hear in movies. It wasn't a sharp bang or a dramatic explosion. It was a deep, violent, crushing sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Metal folding in on itself, energy releasing in a way that felt almost physical, like the air itself recoiled from it. Even now, 21 years later, that sound still resonates in my memory. I can hear it if I think about it too long. It's the kind of sound your brain files under danger, under finality, under things that can't be undone. I remember screaming something into the phone, telling the dispatcher that the crash had just happened, that it was right in front of me. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. Traffic stopped almost instantly. People were pulling over, jumping out of their cars, yelling, trying to help. The aftermath was chaos, but also strangely ordered in the way emergencies often are. People moved without talking much. Someone called for ambulances even though I was already on the line. Someone else tried to direct traffic away. There was shouting, but also moments of eerie quiet, where everyone just stood there, staring. The people in the other car survived. That's the part that still feels almost miraculous. They were wearing seatbelts, their airbags deployed. Their car absorbed the impact the way it was designed to. They were shaken, injured, bleeding, but they were able to walk away. When I saw them standing there afterward, alive, it felt unreal, like the universe had made a small, merciful exception in the middle of something horrible. The driver of the wrong-way car did not survive. He was apparently severely intoxicated. No seatbelt. An older, compact junker of a car, with none of the modern safety features that might have saved him or at least given him a chance. He was killed on impact. I didn't see his body clearly, and I'm grateful for that, but I knew. Everyone there knew. There's a certain stillness that leaves no room for doubt. What stuck with me afterward wasn't just the tragedy itself, but how close I had been to it. That car had passed me seconds before the crash. If the timing had been slightly different, if I had been a little farther ahead or behind, that head-on collision could have involved me. That realization crept in later, quietly, when the adrenaline wore off and my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I had done what I could. I had called it in. I had tried to warn someone, but there was no stopping it once it reached that blind rise. The physics, the speed, the alcohol, all of it had already decided the outcome. For a long time after that, driving felt different. Every time I crested a hill, I found myself gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. Every time I saw headlights where they shouldn't be, my heart skipped. I became more aware of how fragile safety really is on the road, how much we trust strangers to follow the rules without ever thinking about it. And that sound never left. It doesn't play constantly in my head, but it's there, waiting. Sometimes it comes back when I hear a sudden loud noise, or when I read about a crash, or when someone talks casually about driving drunk like it's not a big deal. It reminds me that consequences aren't abstract. They're immediate, violent, and permanent. I think about the people in the other car sometimes. How close they came to dying, how a seatbelt and an airbag made the difference between walking away and never walking again. I think about the driver who caused it too, not with sympathy for his choices, but with that heavy awareness that one decision, one night, one drive, ended his life and nearly took others with it. Mostly, though, I think about how fast it all happened. One moment I was driving east, thinking about nothing in particular. The next, I was listening to a crash that would stay with me for decades. There was no buildup, no warning beyond a brief glimpse of a car where it didn't belong. Just a wrong turn, a blind rise, and a sound that still echoes. Even now, 21 years later, it hasn't faded, and I don't think it ever will. This story has always been part of the place where I live. The kind of story you grow up hearing without really questioning it at first. It isn't told like a ghost story meant to scare children. It's told more like a warning, something old and heavy that belongs to the land itself. The kind of story people lower their voices for, even if they claim they don't believe in curses or the devil or anything supernatural. In the town where I live in Sweden, there is a large castle known as Bogasunds slott. It's an imposing place surrounded by forest and water, standing quietly as if it has been watching generations of people come and go. On the surface, it looks like any other old European castle, the kind tourists might visit for history or architecture. But if you live nearby, you learn very quickly that this castle carries a reputation far darker than most. According to local legend, the castle is haunted by the devil himself. The story goes back to the 17th century, when the castle was first built in the 1640s. At that time, it was owned by Count Per Brahe the Younger, a powerful and influential nobleman in Sweden. Per Brahe was not just wealthy, he was deeply involved in politics and governance, a man whose words carried weight. When someone like that made a declaration or a threat, people listened. The legend says that Per Brahe placed a curse on the castle and the land it stood on. The curse was simple, but terrifying. If anyone ever tried to rebuild or significantly alter the castle after his time, the devil himself would haunt the grounds, not just appear in visions or whispers, but actively bring misfortune to those responsible for the rebuilding. The land, according to the curse, would never accept being reshaped without exacting a price. What makes this story harder to dismiss is that it isn't just something passed down orally. There is said to be a large rock near the castle where the curse was written down by Per Brahe himself. Whether you believe that the exact words were carved by his hand or not, the fact that such a rock exists, tied so directly to the legend, gives it a sense of permanence. It anchors the story in something physical, something you can stand next to and touch. Over the centuries, the castle has been rebuilt and restored multiple times. Each time, something strange seems to happen. The first time the castle was rebuilt after Per Brahe's era, the man responsible for overseeing the rebuilding died just 1 month before the work was completed. His death came suddenly, without warning, and people at the time whispered that it was no coincidence. They spoke of the curse in hushed tones, wondering if the devil had claimed his first victim. Not long after that, another man involved in the same rebuilding effort also died. This one passed away about a month after the work was finished. 2 deaths, both tied closely in time to the reconstruction of the castle, were enough to make people uneasy. Even in an age when death was more common and medicine far less advanced, the timing felt wrong. Too neat. Too deliberate. As the years went on, the castle continued to change hands. Fires, decay, and time itself made rebuilding necessary more than once. And each time plans were made to restore or rebuild Bogasunds slott, the old story resurfaced. People would bring up Per Brahe's curse. People would point to the rock with the inscription. People would remind each other of the men who died before and after earlier renovations. Some laughed it off, others didn't. What's unsettling is that the curse doesn't describe random hauntings or vague misfortune. It specifically targets those who take responsibility for rebuilding the castle. The legend doesn't say the devil would kill visitors, villagers, or passers-by. It says he would haunt the ground and punish the ones who tried to defy the warning. That specificity makes it linger in the mind. Even today, people argue about whether the deaths were coincidence, stress, illness, or something more. Rational explanations exist, of course. Construction projects are stressful. Powerful men often lived hard lives. 17th and 18th century health was fragile at best. But legends don't survive for centuries on logic alone. They survive because patterns repeat often enough to make people uneasy. The castle itself adds to that feeling. Bogasund's slot doesn't feel welcoming in the way some historic buildings do. There's a heaviness to it, especially on quiet days when the forest around it seems too still. Sound carries strangely there. Footsteps echo longer than they should. Wind through the trees feels more deliberate, as if it's moving with purpose rather than randomness. Locals will tell you that being near the castle at dusk feels different. The light fades faster there. Shadows stretch and cling to the stone walls. Even people who don't believe in the curse admit they don't like being alone near the building after dark. It's not fear exactly, it's discomfort, a sense that you're somewhere you're not entirely welcome. The idea that the devil himself haunts the grounds is, of course, extreme. But in older folklore, the devil isn't always a horned figure appearing in flames. Sometimes he's simply a force of consequence, something that ensures warnings are taken seriously. In that sense, the curse feels less like a religious threat and more like a declaration of defiance. Per Braha, a powerful man even in death, refusing to let his legacy be altered without cost. What makes the story stick with me is how intertwined it is with real history. This isn't a made-up haunted house built to scare tourists. The castle is real. The Count was real. The rebuilding efforts were real. The deaths were real. And the rock with the curse is real enough that people still talk about it today. That combination of documented history and folklore is what gives the legend its strength. If this were just a story about a ghost seen in a window or footsteps heard in a hallway, it might have faded. Instead, it's a story about consequences, about hubris, about ignoring warnings left behind by someone who believed his words would matter long after he was gone. Living near a place like that changes how you think about history. You don't just see castles as beautiful old buildings. You see them as containers of intention, belief, and unresolved tension. Every stone was placed by someone who lived a full life, made enemies, held power, and feared something. When you walk near Bogasund's slot, you aren't just walking past architecture. You're walking through centuries of unresolved promises and threats. I don't know if the devil haunts the castle. I don't know if Per Braha's curse holds any real supernatural power. But I do know that the pattern is strange. I know that people connected to rebuilding efforts have died at eerily consistent times. I know that locals who laugh during the day grow quieter when the conversation turns to the castle at night. And I know that the presence of that rock, with its warning carved into it, feels like something meant to be taken seriously, whether you believe in curses or not. Some places feel neutral. You pass through them and leave nothing behind. Bogasund's slot doesn't feel neutral. It feels like a place that remembers, a place that keeps score, a place that doesn't forget when someone challenges what was laid down centuries ago. Whether that force is superstition, coincidence, or something far older and darker is impossible to say. But when a legend survives nearly 400 years, when it continues to line up with real events in unsettling ways, it earns a certain kind of respect. Even disbelief feels quieter there. And standing near the castle, knowing its history, knowing what happened to the men who ignored the curse, it's hard not to feel that you're on land that was warned, very clearly, to be left alone. It happened while I was in college, in a town that had always felt safe. Not big city safe, but small town safe. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, where you recognized faces at the grocery store, where crime felt distant and abstract, like something that happened somewhere else to other people. That sense of safety was so normal that no one ever thought to question it. Then one day, in broad daylight, that illusion was ripped apart. A man was found almost completely beheaded. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't discovered days later. It happened out in the open during the day, and a jogger stumbled across him not long after it happened. That detail alone made it hard to process. This wasn't a crime that took place in the dead of night or in some abandoned, forgotten place. It happened while people were awake, while the town was going about its normal routine. The news spread fast. In a town that size, things like that don't stay quiet. Word moved through campus, through local businesses, through social circles. At first, people didn't want to believe it. Rumors came before facts. Some people thought it had to be an accident or some kind of freak occurrence, but the details that followed made it impossible to deny the truth. This was murder, and not just murder, but extreme violence, the kind that makes your stomach drop when you hear about it. Investigators brought in specialists, including blade experts, to try to understand what kind of weapon could have done that much damage. That alone said a lot. This wasn't random or sloppy. It was deliberate, forceful, and brutal. The man who was killed wasn't a stranger. That's what made it worse. He was a good guy. People knew him. He worked at the local grocery store, the kind of place everyone shopped at, sometimes multiple times a week. He was familiar in that quiet, everyday way. You might not have known his full story, but you recognized his face. Maybe he rang up your groceries. Maybe he helped you find something on a shelf. Maybe you exchanged small talk without thinking twice. Knowing that someone so ordinary, so woven into daily life, could be taken like that made everything feel unstable. The investigation dragged on, and nothing came of it. They looked at everything. They chased leads. They brought in experts. They followed up on tips. And still, no one was arrested. No suspect was named. No clear explanation emerged. The killer was never found. That uncertainty hung over the town like a fog. People started coming up with theories. Some thought it was personal, that the victim had known his killer. Others thought it was random, which was somehow even more terrifying. There were rumors about transient workers, about someone passing through, about someone local hiding in plain sight. None of it was confirmed. None of it brought comfort. What mattered was that someone had done this and had disappeared. The summer after it happened felt different. You could feel it in the air, even if no one talked about it directly. The town didn't suddenly become dangerous in a measurable way, but it felt dangerous in a psychological one. The trust that had existed without effort was gone. Every shadow felt a little heavier. Every unfamiliar face stood out more than it used to. Being out at night felt strange. Before, walking after dark hadn't even crossed my mind as a risk. People went for late-night walks, jogged, biked, met friends, moved freely. After the murder, that changed. Streets that used to feel harmless suddenly felt exposed. Quiet didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watchful. I started carrying pepper spray. That was something I had never done before. It wasn't because someone told me to. It wasn't because I had experienced anything personally. It was because the town had taught me, without saying it out loud, that things could happen here, too. I also started carrying a flashlight in my pocket at night, not just for visibility, but for awareness. Light became a form of control, a way to push back against the unknown. I wasn't alone in that. You could see the change in others, too. Fewer people out late, groups instead of individuals. People checking over their shoulders. Conversations that ended with, "Be careful," when they never had before. Parents calling their kids more often. Friends texting each other to say they got home safely. All because of one crime that never found an ending. What made it especially unsettling was that there was no resolution to anchor the fear. If someone had been caught, even if the story was horrifying, there would have been a sense of closure, a reason, a boundary. But with no arrest, the threat felt open-ended. It wasn't tied to a person or a place. It could be anywhere. Even now, the last I heard, the local police department was still offering a reward for any leads. That says everything. Years later, the case still isn't closed. Somewhere in the back of people's minds, it lingers. It's not something everyone thinks about every day, but it never fully disappears either. It comes back when you hear footsteps behind you at night, when you walk past the spot where it happened, when you see a jogger on a quiet path and feel a strange twist of unease. What stays with me the most isn't just the violence itself. It's how fast everything changed. One day, it was a safe college town where danger felt hypothetical. The next, it was a place where people learned that terrible things don't need permission to happen, and they don't always come with answers afterward. The man who was killed is still remembered by people who knew him, not as a headline, but as a person, a co-worker, a familiar face, someone who didn't deserve what happened to him. That's important because it's easy for cases like this to turn into mysteries instead of losses. For those of us who lived there, that summer marked a line between before and after. Before, safety was assumed. After, safety was something you actively thought about, prepared for, and tried to protect. And once you lose that kind of innocence about a place, you never fully get it back. Sleep paralysis was part of my childhood before I ever had the language to understand what it was. At the time, it wasn't a condition or a sleep disorder. It was just something terrifying that happened to me in the dark, something that made nighttime feel unpredictable and dangerous in a way I couldn't explain to anyone properly. I was very young when it started, around 5 years old, maybe even a little younger. I would wake up from sleep and realize I couldn't move. My eyes would be open, my thoughts would be clear enough to know something was wrong, but my body refused to respond. I couldn't lift my arms, I couldn't turn my head, I couldn't even scream. The best I could do was breathe, shallow and fast, while panic crawled up my chest. At first, the paralysis itself was the scariest part. Being trapped inside your own body as a child is overwhelming in a way adults often underestimate. You don't have the logic yet to tell yourself it will pass. You don't know what sleep paralysis is. All you know is that you are awake, something is wrong, and you have no control. Then one night it went further. I woke up, and this time I could move. At least I thought I could. I remember sitting up or standing up. The memory is fuzzy now, but I know I was no longer paralyzed. Everything felt real. The room looked the same. The lighting was the same dim nighttime glow that always came from the hallway. My bed was exactly where it should be. And then I looked at it. I saw myself. I was lying there in the bed, asleep, my body, my face, my small chest rising and falling. It wasn't distorted or shadowy or dreamlike. It looked exactly the way it should have looked, like I was looking at another person who just happened to be me. Even as a child, that was enough to trigger pure terror. There was no curiosity, no sense of wonder, just instant, instinctive fear. Something in my brain knew this was wrong. I didn't understand what out of body meant. I didn't have words like dissociation or hallucination. I just knew that I was looking at myself sleeping, and that knowledge broke something inside me. That's when I woke up. Except I didn't really wake up. I snapped back into my body and realized I was paralyzed again. My arms and legs wouldn't move. My chest felt tight. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst. I tried to call for my parents, but nothing came out. The room felt heavier now, like the air itself was pressing down on me. Then I heard my name. It wasn't someone calling me from down the hall. It wasn't my parents' voices. It wasn't familiar or comforting in any way. It was deep, distorted, and wrong, like a voice filtered through something broken. It said my name over and over again, repeating it in slow increments. each time feeling closer and more intrusive than the last. I can't fully describe how it sounded, only how it felt. It didn't sound like it came from a mouth. It sounded like it came from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The way it said my name made it feel like it knew me in a way that wasn't safe. I was frozen there, listening. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence afterward was almost worse. My body slowly came back to me. I could move my fingers, then my arms, then my legs. I bolted upright, gasping, soaked in fear. I didn't sleep much after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I was afraid I'd slip back into it. The next day, I told my father what happened. He listened, but he didn't believe it the way I needed him to. He told me it was just a dream. He insisted it wasn't real. He said monsters weren't real and voices like that couldn't happen. He wasn't cruel about it. He was trying to protect me, trying to reassure me. But to a child who had experienced something that felt vividly real, that reassurance didn't land. It made me feel misunderstood, like I had imagined something so terrible that even adults didn't want to acknowledge it. Then I told my mother. Her reaction was different. She told me that she used to get sleep paralysis too when she was my age. She explained that it can happen when you're very tired, that your mind wakes up before your body does. Hearing that helped a little. It gave me a framework, a way to think about it that didn't involve monsters or voices from the dark. But then I told her the part that mattered most to me. I told her that before the voice, before the paralysis, I had seen myself sleeping on the bed. She looked at me strangely, not scared, not angry, just puzzled. She told me it was probably nothing to worry about. That answer stayed with me longer than anything else. Not because it comforted me, but because it didn't explain anything. It felt like a door gently closing on a question I was too young to articulate properly. For a while after that, the episode stopped. Months went by without anything happening. I started to relax again, started to sleep without fear every night. Life moved forward the way childhood does, one day bleeding into the next. Around that time, my family was getting ready to move to a different house. Boxes appeared, rooms slowly emptied. Familiar spaces began to feel temporary. Then it happened again. This time was worse. I woke up in the middle of the night and instantly knew I was in sleep paralysis. There was no confusion this time. I recognized the feeling immediately. My body was locked in place. My arms and legs wouldn't respond. Panic surged stronger than before because now I knew what this was and I knew what could come with it. The room was dark but not pitch black. The bathroom across the hall was visible through my open door. The door to the bathroom was also open. Everything looked normal, and that somehow made it worse. There was no obvious threat to focus on, nothing to fight or run from. Then the voice came back. This time it wasn't calling my name. It was coming from the bathroom. It spoke clearly, slowly, with that same deep, distorted tone that made my skin crawl. And it said, word for word, "I'm a part of you. You mustn't be afraid." I remember those words with painful clarity, not just the sound of them, but the meaning. They didn't feel random. They felt intentional, personal, as if whatever was speaking wasn't trying to scare me in the obvious way monsters do in stories, but in a deeper, more unsettling way. It wasn't threatening me. It was claiming something. I was 5 years old. I had no way to process that. All I could do was panic silently, my thoughts racing, my chest tight, my body useless. I tried to look away from the bathroom and tried to focus on something else in the room that might ground me. My eyes darted around as much as they could without moving my head. That's when I saw the eyes. They were red, not glowing brightly, not exaggerated like something from a cartoon or a movie, just red enough to be unmistakable. They were looking at me through the crack of the bathroom door, right where the hinges would be. A narrow space, a place you wouldn't normally look. And yet, there they were, watching. They didn't blink, they didn't move. They just stayed there, fixed on me. I couldn't scream, I couldn't move, I couldn't look away. As a child, the terror was absolute. There was no buffer, no rationalization, no internal voice telling me this would end. I was trapped in that moment with something that felt aware of me, something that felt real in a way that went beyond imagination. Eventually, the paralysis broke. I don't remember how. I don't remember the exact moment my body came back online. I just remember the aftermath, the shaking, the sobbing, the way my heart wouldn't slow down, the way I refused to close my eyes for the rest of the night. That episode never fully left me. Even now, decades later, thinking about it gives me goosebumps. The image of those eyes, the sound of that voice, the feeling of being watched and claimed while completely helpless. All of it is burned into my memory. It doesn't feel like a dream when I think back on it. It feels like a memory of something that happened to me. As I grew older, I tried to understand it. I read everything I could about sleep paralysis. I learned about hypnagogic hallucinations, about how the brain can create vivid sensory experiences when consciousness and REM sleep overlap. I learned that people often hear voices, see figures, feel presences. I learned that fear amplifies everything. But the red eyes bothered me. So did the words. Everything I read seemed to circle back to the same imagery. Dark figures, watching eyes, voices that claim familiarity. Many explanations referenced cultural interpretations, including demons. I didn't want to accept that. I still don't fully accept it. But it's hard to ignore how consistent the themes are across people who have never spoken to each other. After that second major episode, something else began to happen. I started lucid dreaming. Almost always, it begins with sleep paralysis, that frozen state where my mind wakes up first. But instead of terror, I learned how to shift into awareness, how to recognize what was happening and move through it into a dream where I had control. It took years. It wasn't intentional at first. It was survival. A way for my brain to avoid panic by turning the paralysis into something else. Over time, it became familiar, manageable, even useful. But one thing never returned. The eyes never came back. The voice never came back. I still get sleep paralysis occasionally, even now. I still enter lucid dreams through it. But whatever that was when I was a child, whatever manifested as a voice and red eyes in my bathroom doorway, it never appeared again. I don't know why. I don't know if it was just my childhood brain, fear magnified by exhaustion, or something else entirely. I don't know if moving houses mattered. I don't know if growing older changed how my mind handles those states. What I do know is how real it felt. I know how deeply it affected me. I know how it shaped the way I think about sleep, consciousness, and fear. I know that even now I am cautious in ways I can't fully explain. I know that when I feel that familiar paralysis creeping in, part of me still remembers being 5 years old, staring at red eyes in the dark, unable to move. I don't claim to know what it was. I don't say it was a demon with certainty, but I also don't dismiss it as nothing. Some experiences leave marks that logic alone doesn't erase. They sit quietly in the background of your life, influencing how you interpret things, how you protect yourself, how you move through the night. This is one of those experiences for me. It happened. It terrified me. And even though it never returned in the same form, it changed me in ways I'm still unraveling. This happened to a friend of a friend, and even hearing it secondhand still makes my stomach tighten because of how easily it could have ended differently. She was driving home late at night along rural back roads in the UK. the kind of roads that cut straight through dense wooded areas with long stretches of darkness between villages. No streetlights, no houses, and very little traffic once it gets late. If you've ever driven those roads at night, you know how isolating they feel. Your headlights are the only real source of light, and everything beyond them just disappears into blackness. She wasn't doing anything unusual. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't swerving. Her car was in good condition. All the lights were working, and she hadn't had anything to drink. She was just trying to get home. At some point, she noticed headlights behind her in her rear view mirror. That alone wasn't alarming. Another car on a country road isn't unusual, even late at night. But the way it followed her started to feel strange. It stayed close, not overtaking, not falling back. Just there, matching her speed through the twists and bends of the road. Then the sirens came on. Blue lights flashed behind her. Her heart jumped instantly. That automatic surge of panic you get when you think you're being pulled over, even when you know you've done nothing wrong. She slowed slightly, checking her speed again, mentally running through everything that could possibly explain it. But nothing made sense. She hadn't committed any offense. There was no reason for the police to stop her. That's when the doubt crept in. Something felt off. The location was wrong. The timing was wrong. The way the car had followed her beforehand was wrong. Instead of pulling over immediately, she made a decision that likely saved her life. She kept driving. She called a number that allows drivers in the UK to verify whether a police vehicle is legitimate and active in their area. Her hands were shaking as she explained the situation, trying to stay calm while keeping her eyes on the road. The operator asked for her location and details about what was happening. Then they told her something chilling. There were no police cars logged as operating in that area, none. The operator immediately told her not to stop under any circumstances. They instructed her to keep driving, stay on the line, and head toward a more populated area if possible. At the same time, they dispatched 2 marked police cars to her location. Behind her, the fake police car stayed close, lights still flashing, sirens still blaring, trying to force her to pull over. Every instinct probably screamed at her to stop, because that's what you're taught to do when police signal you. But she trusted her gut and the person on the phone instead. She kept driving. The road stretched on, dark and narrow, trees closing in on both sides. Every second must have felt endless. She had no way of knowing what the man behind her would do if she slowed too much or tried to turn off. She just focused on keeping the car steady and moving. Then, ahead of her, real police cars appeared. 2 of them. They moved quickly, positioning themselves to box in the car that had been following her. Within moments, it was over. The fake police car was forced to stop. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, shouting commands. The man inside was dragged out of the vehicle and arrested on the spot. Only after she was safe did the full reality sink in. The man had been deliberately targeting women who were driving alone at night through that wooded area. He had fitted his car with fake police lights and a siren. He would pull them over by impersonating an officer, relying on the fact that most people wouldn't question it, especially in an isolated place. Once they stopped, he raped them. She wasn't his first victim. Hearing that afterward made everything feel even more horrifying. The idea that this had been happening repeatedly, that other women hadn't had the chance or the instinct or the ability to verify what was happening, is terrifying. The fact that he used authority and fear to trap people in the middle of nowhere makes it even worse. If she had pulled over immediately, like most people are conditioned to do, the outcome could have been completely different. What makes this story stick with me is how subtle the danger was. There was nothing dramatic at first. No masked man. No sudden attack. Just flashing lights, something that most people are trained from childhood to obey without hesitation. He weaponized trust, routine, and isolation. It also changed how people in that area thought about safety. Afterward, a lot of women talked about how uneasy those roads felt. Even during the day, people shared the story with each other as a warning. It became one of those local truths that spreads quietly, not to scare people unnecessarily, but to remind them to trust their instincts and verify when something feels wrong. For her, it was a near miss that she'll never forget. She did everything right, not because she followed a rule book, but because she listened to the part of her that said something wasn't right. That decision, made in seconds on a dark road, put the power back in her hands long enough for real help to arrive. It's one of those stories that makes you realize how thin the line can be between a normal night and a life-altering trauma, how easily danger can disguise itself as authority, and how important it is that people know they're allowed to question, to verify, and to protect themselves, even when the situation looks official. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing on the road isn't a stranger hiding in the dark. It's someone counting on you to stop without asking why. I want to be careful with how I talk about this because it isn't just a creepy story to me. It's tied to real history, real suffering, and real people who didn't get the chance to grow up. Even now, thinking about it makes my chest feel heavy, in a way that fear alone doesn't explain. I attend a boarding school for First Nations teens. It's meant to be a place of support, education, and healing. But long before this school existed, the land held something very different. The buildings that stand there now were built on the grounds of a former residential school. That fact alone carries weight. Everyone who attends knows the history, even if we don't always talk about it openly. Many Indigenous children were taken there. Many of them suffered, and many of them never went home. Those aren't just stories in books. They happened right there. When I first arrived, I tried not to think too much about it. I didn't want to walk into school already afraid. The dorms looked normal enough. Hallways, bedrooms, washrooms, study rooms. It felt like any other boarding school on the surface. If you didn't know the history, you could almost forget where you were. Almost. Very quickly, I started hearing things from my roommates. Not rumors in the dramatic sense, but quiet statements said in passing. The kind people make when they're not trying to scare you, just telling you what they've seen. They talked about black figures, shapes in the washrooms, shadows standing where no one should be standing, figures in bedrooms late at night that didn't move like people do. At first, I didn't believe it, not because I thought they were lying, but because I didn't want to. It felt easier to assume stress, imagination, or exhaustion. Boarding school is hard. Being away from home is hard. Sleep schedules are off. People are emotional. There are a lot of reasons for your mind to play tricks on you. I told myself that was probably all it was. But even as I said that, something about the way they talked about it stayed with me. They weren't laughing. They weren't exaggerating. They spoke in low voices, sometimes changing the subject right after, like they didn't want to dwell on it too long. I stayed in my assigned room and tried to ignore everything. For a while, nothing happened. Then one night, I was alone in my room. It was quiet in a way that felt unnatural. Not just no talking, but no movement at all. No footsteps in the hall. No voices through the walls. No doors opening or closing. The kind of silence that makes you more aware of your own breathing. I was resting, not fully asleep, but not fully awake either. Just lying there, staring at nothing, letting my mind drift. I wasn't thinking about ghosts or history or anything scary. I was just tired. That's when I heard it, a whisper, not across the room, not down the hallway, right beside my ear, so close that my entire body reacted before my mind did. My skin prickled, my heart jumped. I froze instantly, too scared to even turn my head. The voice didn't sound like an adult. It didn't sound deep or threatening. It sounded young, like a child. It kept whispering, fast and urgent, overlapping itself like there were multiple voices speaking at once. I could hear the panic in them, the confusion, the desperation. Look, look, look here, no, over here. They're coming. They're coming, hurry. Go hide in there. He hurt me, he hurt me, he hurt me. Over and over again, the voices sounded like boys, maybe 8 to 13 years old. Not one voice, but several, layered together. Some higher, some lower, all whispering in a way that felt frantic and scared. They didn't sound angry, they sounded terrified. That's what made it worse. I couldn't move. I wasn't in sleep paralysis exactly, but fear had locked me in place just as effectively. I didn't want to acknowledge what was happening. I didn't want to look around. I didn't want to confirm anything with my eyes. All I could do was lie there, listening, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might give me away somehow. The whispers weren't random. They felt like memories, like moments repeating themselves, like fear caught in a loop. The words didn't sound like something meant for me, but like something being replayed again and again without awareness of who was listening. And there was grief in them, deep grief. I don't know how long it lasted. It felt like a long time, but it could have been seconds. When it finally stopped, the silence rushed back in, heavier than before. I lay there shaking, trying to convince myself I had imagined it, that stress or exhaustion had done something to my mind. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The next day, I told one of the house counselors that I didn't want to stay in that room anymore. I didn't even go into full detail at first. I just said I didn't feel safe there, that it was affecting me. I could tell by the look on their face that I wasn't the first student to say something like that. They listened. They didn't laugh. They didn't dismiss me. That alone said more than words ever could. While I was still staying in that room, something else happened. The study room was directly across the hall from my bedroom. It was a quiet space where students could work, read, or just sit when they didn't want to be in their rooms. One evening, I was walking past it when I glanced inside, and I saw them. 3 black figures. They weren't solid like people. They didn't have faces I could see clearly. They looked like tall shadows standing where the desks were, darker than the darkness around them. They weren't moving fast or dramatically. They were just there, occupying space, watching. I stopped walking without meaning to. My body reacted again before my thoughts did. The figures didn't rush at me. They didn't vanish immediately either. They just stood there. And the longer I looked, the more wrong it felt. Then I looked away. When I looked back, they were gone. That confirmed what my roommates had been saying all along. It wasn't just one person seeing things. It wasn't just imagination. Too many people had described the same things in the same places. After that, I avoided the study room as much as possible. I started sleeping with the light on. I kept my door closed. I stayed around other people whenever I could. The dorm didn't feel like a place to rest anymore. It felt like a place where something was always present, something unseen but aware. What made it especially hard was knowing the history. Residential schools were places where children were hurt, abused, punished, and silenced. Many died there. Many were buried without ceremony, without families being told. The voices I heard didn't feel random. They felt connected to that history, to fear, to hiding, to pain. When the whispers said, "He hurt me," it didn't feel symbolic. It felt literal. That's what broke my heart more than anything else. It wasn't just scary, it was sad. The idea that children who suffered so much might still be tied to that place. Repeating moments of fear is devastating. Whether you believe in spirits or not, the emotional weight of that land is undeniable. Trauma doesn't just disappear because buildings change. I don't tell this story lightly. I know some people will say it's stress, imagination, or suggestion. I understand that response. I've thought about those explanations myself. But knowing what I experienced, knowing how real it felt, knowing how many others have seen similar things, makes it impossible for me to brush it aside completely. When summer break came, I felt relief. Being away from that building, from that room, from that energy, helped me breathe again. I slept better. I felt lighter. The fear faded, but the memory didn't. Now, as I think about going back to school, my biggest hope is that I'll be placed in a different area, somewhere farther from that room, somewhere that doesn't carry the same weight. I don't know if that will make a difference, but I need to try. I still respect the land. I still think about the children who were taken there. I don't feel anger toward whatever I encountered, just sadness and a deep sense of injustice that what happened to them was ever allowed to happen at all. This isn't something I share for attention or shock. It's something I carry. Some places hold memories so deep they don't fade. Whether you believe those memories can manifest as voices or figures doesn't change the truth that pain leaves marks. And sometimes those marks are felt by people who come long after, people who never asked to inherit them. I just hope that wherever those children are now, they are finally safe. When I was about 10 years old, riding my BMX was one of the few things that made me feel completely free. I lived in a quiet neighborhood where kids still played outside, and most days after school or on weekends, I would grab my bike and meet up with a friend who lived just a few streets away. We didn't think much about danger back then. The world felt small, familiar, and mostly safe. Everyone knew everyone, or at least that's what it felt like at the time. That particular day started like any other. The sun was out, the air was warm, and my friend and I were riding our bikes close to my house, talking about random things that only kids care about. We were laughing, doing small jumps off the curb, and racing each other down the street. There was nothing unusual about the day, nothing that felt off or threatening. It was just another normal afternoon. At some point, my neighbor came over to us. He lived a few houses down and was someone I recognized, an adult I had seen around many times before. He looked a bit serious, which was unusual because most adults either ignored us or casually waved as we rode by. He told us that earlier someone had come to the front of my house asking questions about me. He said it felt strange and that the person asking didn't seem like they belonged in the neighborhood. He even said he thought they might have been planning to kidnap me. I remember how that sounded at the time. Kidnapping felt like something out of movies or scary stories adults told to make kids behave. It didn't feel real. I honestly thought my neighbor was exaggerating or trying to scare me. Maybe he was joking, or maybe he was just being overly cautious. Either way, I didn't take it seriously. I shrugged it off, laughed a little, and went right back to riding my bike. In my head, nothing like that could actually happen to me, especially not in my own neighborhood. About half an hour later, my friend and I were riding on a different road, a bit farther from my house, but still close enough to feel familiar. The street wasn't very busy, and there weren't many people around. I remember the sound of a car slowing down behind us. When I looked over, I saw a beige Land Cruiser pull up nearby. It immediately caught my attention because I didn't recognize the vehicle, and it wasn't common to see cars stopping near kids like that. There were 3 teenagers inside the car. I had never seen any of them before. They didn't look like they were from the neighborhood, and something about the way they were watching me made my stomach tighten. One of them leaned out slightly and called to me by name. Hearing my name come from a stranger's mouth was shocking. It felt wrong, like a line had been crossed. They said, "Hey you, are you Illicit Razor? Get in the car." As they said it, the passenger door opened and one of them started to get out. Everything happened very quickly, but at the same time it felt like time slowed down. My heart started pounding and a wave of fear rushed through my body. Suddenly my neighbor's warning didn't feel like a joke anymore. It felt terrifyingly real. I didn't think. I didn't stop to ask questions or try to understand what was happening. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I dropped my bike right there on the road and ran as fast as I could. I didn't look back. All I could think about was getting away. My legs felt heavy, but adrenaline pushed me forward. I ran straight to my friend's house, my chest burning, my breath coming in sharp gasps. When I reached his house, I ran around the back and hid, crouching down and trying to stay out of sight. I was shaking so badly that I could barely control my breathing. My friend was just as scared as I was, his eyes wide as he tried to understand what had just happened. His dad heard the commotion and went out to the front of the house to see what was going on. From where I was hiding, I couldn't see much, but I could hear voices. His dad confronted the teenagers and asked them what they were doing. They laughed it off and said it was just a joke. They claimed they were messing around and didn't mean any harm. After that, they got back into the car and drove away. I never saw them again. Even though they said it was a joke, nothing about it felt like one. The fear didn't go away when the car left. It stayed with me, sinking deep into my chest. That day changed something inside me. The world didn't feel as safe as it had just a few hours earlier. Streets that once felt familiar now seemed full of hidden dangers. Every unfamiliar car made my heart race. Every stranger felt like a possible threat. For the next 3 years, I was scared to go outside. Riding my bike, something I had once loved, became something I avoided. I stayed closer to home, and even then, I was always on edge. I watched cars carefully, memorized faces, and constantly looked over my shoulder. My parents noticed that I had changed, that I was quieter and more anxious, but it was hard to explain the fear in a way that made sense to them. At night, I would replay the moment in my head over and over again. The sound of the car slowing down, my name being called, the door opening. I wondered what would have happened if I hadn't run. I wondered why they knew my name. I wondered if they really had been joking, or if something much worse had almost happened. As I got older, I started to understand just how close I might have come to something truly dangerous. What scared me the most wasn't just the memory of that day, but the realization of how quickly life can change. One normal afternoon, one decision to run instead of hesitate, and everything after that became different. Even now, years later, that fear hasn't completely disappeared. It shaped how I see the world and how I think about safety. It taught me that danger doesn't always announce itself clearly, and that sometimes the things adults warn you about are real, even when they sound exaggerated at first. That day stayed with me, not as a single moment, but as a long shadow that followed me through my childhood. And even though nothing else like that ever happened again, the impact of it lasted far longer than the few minutes it took for a beige Land Cruiser to pull up and drive away. This happened with me while I was in college, during a time when life was supposed to be about exams, late-night coffee runs, and the slow transition into adulthood. My university was located near a coastline, a place where the air always smelled faintly of salt, and the fog would roll in thick and heavy during the early morning hours. In this town, there was a somewhat well-known bridge, a massive steel structure that arched over a deep, turbulent stretch of water. At its highest point, the road was something like 200 feet above the surface. It was a beautiful sight from a distance, especially at sunset. But for those of us who lived there, it carried a weight that was hard to shake. It was the kind of place that looked majestic in photos, but felt cold and indifferent when you were actually standing on it. It was a landmark, yes, but it was also a place where the veil between life and something much darker seemed to be at its thinnest. The horror of what happened there didn't start with a ghost or a monster in the woods. It started with the shattering of a human mind. There was a father in our community who was spiraling through a complete and total mental breakdown. We often hear the term mental breakdown used casually, but in this case, it was a visceral, terrifying disintegration of a man's soul. He wasn't just sad or stressed. He was lost in a psychological wilderness where the rules of love and protection had been completely erased. One afternoon, while the rest of the town was busy with their mundane routines, this man strapped his 5-year-old daughter into her car seat and began the long drive toward the bridge. I often wonder what was going through his head during that drive. Was it a calculated plan, or was he being driven by a voice that wasn't his own? The child, in her innocence, likely thought they were just going for a fun afternoon out, never realizing that her own father had become a stranger in the seat next to her. When they reached the peak of the bridge, 200 feet above the water, he pulled over. The wind up there is always fierce, a constant whistling sound that drowns out everything else. He got out of the car, unbuckled his daughter, and walked her to the edge. The horror of that moment is almost too much to process. A father, the person who is supposed to be a child's ultimate protector, became her greatest threat. Without warning and without hesitation, he threw her over the side. The fall from that height takes several seconds, a terrifying eternity of weightlessness before the impact with the water, which at that speed feels more like concrete than liquid. The silence that followed her disappearance into the depths was likely the most haunting sound of all. Back at my college, we had a very specific group of students who were part of the Marine Search and Rescue Team. These were fucking college kids, as we often called them, mostly 20-somethings who wanted to do something meaningful with their time. They were trained in water safety, boat operation, and basic first aid. For them, 85% of their calls were incredibly routine and almost boring. They would spend their shifts towing in boats that had run out of gas, helping tourists who had gotten their rudders stuck in the mud, or responding to vessels taking on a little bit of water in a storm. It was a job that felt like an adventure, a way to be out on the water and feel like a hero without facing any real life-altering trauma. They were young, full of life, and entirely unprepared for the darkness that was about to find them. When the call came in about a person being seen falling from the bridge, the team was dispatched immediately. Because they were stationed so close to that stretch of water, they were the first ones on the scene. The transition from a quiet afternoon of checking life vests to a high-stakes search operation happened in a heartbeat. As they steered their rescue boat toward the base of the bridge, the massive steel pillars towered over them like the ribs of a giant dead beast. The water was choppy and dark, filled with swirling currents that made it difficult to see anything beneath the surface. They began their search patterns, their eyes scanning the waves for any sign of a bright-colored jacket or a floating shape. There is a specific kind of horror in a water search. It's the uncertainty of what is beneath you, the way the light plays tricks on your eyes, and the knowledge that every second that passes is another second that a life is slipping away. The college kids on that boat were focused, their training taking over, but beneath the surface of their professionalism, a deep sense of dread was starting to settle. They knew the height of the bridge. They knew that a 200-foot fall was rarely survivable. But they were still holding on to the hope that they were on a rescue mission, not a recovery mission. They wanted to believe that they would find a miracle floating in the waves. But the miracle never came. After a grueling search through the cold, gray water, they were the ones who found the body. The discovery was sudden and brutal. One of the students, a kid who probably had a philosophy exam the next day, was the first to see her. The sight was something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Seeing a child in that state, broken by the impact and the betrayal of her own father, is a specialized kind of trauma that changes a person's DNA. They had to pull her out of the water, their hands shaking as they performed the grim task that no 20-year-old should ever have to do. The silence on the boat during the ride back to the station was absolute, a heavy, suffocating weight that marked the end of their innocence. The aftermath of the event was a blur of police reports, news cameras, and a profound sense of shock that settled over the entire campus. We all knew the kids on the SAR team. We saw them in the dining hall, in the library, and at the local bars. But after that day, they were different. There was a distance in their eyes, a haunted look that suggested they had seen something that didn't belong in our world. They had gone out to do a job that usually involved out-of-gas boats, and they had come back as witnesses to a horrific murder. It was a reminder that the world can be a beautiful place full of possibilities, but it is also a place where a father can throw his child off a bridge. The man was eventually caught, and the details of his mental breakdown were analyzed in the local papers, but no amount of explanation could ever make sense of the act. People talked about the pressure of life, the lack of mental health resources, and the tragedies of the human mind. But those words felt empty in the face of a 200-foot drop. The horror wasn't in the why, the horror was in the is. It was the fact that a 5-year-old girl's last experience on this earth was a terrifying fall at the hands of the person she trusted most. It was a story that didn't have a hero, only victims and the young people who were left to clean up the mess. The bridge itself became a different place for us after that. We couldn't drive over it without thinking of that afternoon. We would look over the railing and feel a sense of vertigo that had nothing to do with the height. We were looking into a void, a place where the worst parts of humanity had manifested in a single violent moment. The Marine Search and Rescue Team continued their work, but their calls about boats taking on water never felt the same. Every time the radio crackled to life, there was a collective breath held, a silent prayer that it wasn't another jumper, or worse, another innocent child. The fucking college kids who found her eventually graduated and moved on to other lives, but I know they took that day with them. You don't just forget the weight of a body or the way the water looks when it's hiding a secret. It's a trauma that sits in the back of your mind, a ghost that appears whenever you see a bridge or hear the sound of the ocean. It's the realization that life is fragile, and the people we think are our anchors can sometimes be the ones who pull us down. The beauty of the coastline was forever tainted for me, a reminder that the most picturesque places often hold the darkest histories. I find it terrifying that a mental breakdown can lead to such a specific, calculated act of cruelty. It suggests that deep inside the human mind, there are pathways to darkness that we don't even know exist until it's too late. The father was a man who had presumably loved his daughter for 5 years, who had held her and fed her and watched her grow. And yet, in a matter of minutes, all of that history was discarded for a 200-foot drop. It's a horror that stays with you because it challenges everything you believe about the bond between a parent and a child. The small town where this happened still has that bridge, and people still take photos of it at sunset. But for those of us who were there, the bridge is a monument to a tragedy that should never have happened. It is a reminder that we are all just a few bad decisions or a few broken neurons away from a nightmare. The Marine Search and Rescue Team is still staffed by college kids, young people who are learning about the world one call at a time. I hope for their sake that their calls remain routine, that they only ever have to deal with boats out of gas and tourists who are lost. Because some things are too heavy to carry, and some sights are too dark to ever really see. The memory of the 5-year-old girl is a quiet, tragic presence in our town's history. She represents the ultimate innocence lost, a life that was taken before it even had a chance to begin. And the fact that her end came at the hands of her father is the final lingering horror of the story. It is a narrative of a lucky escape that didn't happen, a reminder that the world is not always a safe place, even in the arms of the people who are supposed to love us. It changed the way I look at families, the way I look at mental health, and the way I look at the water. As I reflect on my time in college, that event stands out as a turning point in my understanding of reality. It was the moment I realized that the fucked up stuff you hear about in the news can happen right next to you, to people you know, in places you love. It was a lesson in the complexity of the human spirit and the devastating power of a mind that has lost its way. The bridge remains, a silent witness to a father's madness and a daughter's end, and the water still flows beneath it, cold and indifferent to the stories it carries. I often think about the students on that boat and how they must feel now, years later. Do they still wake up at night thinking about the search? Do they still feel the vibration of the engine as they moved toward the base of those pillars? I imagine they do. Some experiences are so profound that they become part of who you are, a shadow that follows you into the light. They were just kids, and they were forced to grow up in a matter of minutes. They did their job, they found the body, and they became the keepers of a story that no one ever wanted to tell. The town has likely moved on, as towns always do. The news cycle changed. The father went through the legal system, and a new group of students moved into the dorms. But the bridge is still there, and the air still smells of salt and fog. And somewhere in the collective memory of that place, a 5-year-old girl is still falling, and a group of college kids is still searching the waves. It is a horror that doesn't need a ghost to be haunting, because the reality of what happened is far more terrifying than any fiction could ever be. It is a story of a broken mind, a 200-foot drop, and the loss of something that can never be replaced. I hope that by sharing this, it serves as a reminder to always check on the people in your life, especially those who seem to be struggling. Mental health is a serious and often invisible battle, and the consequences of losing that battle can be catastrophic. We have to be the ones who look out for each other, who reach out when the shadows start to grow too long. Because nobody should have to stand on a bridge alone, and no child should ever have to find out what it's like to fall. The world is full of beauty, but it's also full of bridges, and we have to make sure we're building them for the right reasons. The joyful villa, the kind baker, and the handsome professor, they are all part of the same human tapestry that includes the father on the bridge. We are a species of contradictions, capable of the greatest love and the most horrific violence. And sometimes the only difference between a normal day and a life-altering tragedy is 200 feet of empty air and a moment where the mind finally snaps. I survived my time in college, and I moved on to a life of my own. But a part of me will always be sitting in that library, hearing the sirens in the distance, and knowing that the world had just become a much darker place. The water under the bridge is still racing, and the logs are still jamming, and the people on the shore are still watching. It's a cycle that never ends, a constant movement of life and death that we are all a part of. The best we can do is to hold on to the people we love, to wear our life jackets, and to never take a single second for granted, because you never know when the routine calls will end and the nightmare will begin. Stay safe, stay vigilant, and never forget the story of the 5-year-old girl and the fucking college kids who found her. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.